taking part in an experiment, and their realistic prison setting is in the basement of a university building. But it's complete in every detail, and the students are playing the parts of prisoners and guards. Because the experiment is to test the effect of role-playing on behavior, prisoners and guards were selected by the toss of a coin. No personal preference allowed. But once they are assigned roles, guards are given uniforms and clubs and handcuffs. Prisoners are photographed, fingerprinted, and given white gowns to wear. In effect, the experiment sets up a society composed of two distinct groups, prisoners and guards.
Facility, please read that. Go to cell 5, please. Next man, name, please. Address?
3316 WJ.
Okay, please stand over here. Give me your left hand, please. Flex your finger.
After being admitted, the prisoners were sent as a group to learn the rules.
I'm your warden. Here are the rules. We expect you to know them and be able to recite them by number. Don't smile.
But some prisoners took it lightly.
Hey, John, you got the time?
No.
Oh, come on, John, don't be an idiot. We're both doing the same thing. We're both getting paid the same $15.
Look, you volunteered for this just like I did.
It was all kind of fun for some. They were playing at their roles. But after a few days, some of the students seemed to be taking their roles more seriously. Tension began to build.
Hey, John, where you been? I haven't seen you in 2 days. I thought you went home.
Look, 07153. You know the rules.
Oh, rules my ass. Come on, John.
Look, 07153. You're not paying attention to the rules, you know. Obey them. Read them.
Students playing prisoners were forced to repeat the rules.
Rule number 1. Prisoners must remain silent during rest period. After lights are out. 16. Failure to obey any of the above rules may result in punishment.
May result in punishment.
Bitter fighting started between the two groups. According to Philip Zimbardo, who ran this study at Stanford University, the students simply could not control their behavior. It was as if some powerful force was drawing them into roles of violent dislike, despite all wishes to the contrary. But Zimbardo's work goes beyond the formation of roles. It touches the basic nature of groups as well. For what we saw in the experiment was also the beginning of two groups. The prisoners and the guards are examples of what psychologists call social groups. Groups are the very basis of our existence. We live in neighborhoods and towns and countries. We spend most of our time with other people. And to make society run, we must cooperate. As we fall into groups, we find we must take specialized roles. A group is not just a gathering. People assembled on a train, for instance, are not a social group. They have nothing in common but their destination. Each is dwelling in private thoughts. There is no friendship, no shared interest or common background. As a result, there is no long-term interaction. This is simply a temporary collection of people. But in a true group, people recognize and encounter one another. They interact face-to-face as individuals. And interaction breeds familiarity. Familiarity usually leads to some sort of affection. So the members of a group are bound by emotional ties. This is not to say that everyone has to love everyone else, but they often have positive regard for each other. People in a true group also share the same expectations as to how they should behave. These expectations are called group norms, and they become a standard for guiding your behavior. And not only a standard for assessing your behavior, but also for the group to use in protecting its integrity. People who march to a different drummer will often find that groups bring pressures to make its members conform. Members of a true group share basic goals. To soldiers, for instance, the goal is victory, or perhaps just survival. Of course, victory depends on tight cooperation. Cooperation means that roles within the group are interdependent. Group members depend on each other in military groups as well as in less structured groups. And social groups usually have a leader. This leader may be smarter, trickier, more enthusiastic, more confident, and fair than the other group members. Often the leader is simply better at stating goals and helping members achieve them. Because of the leader, the interactions, the familiarity, the roles, the interdependence, the common interests, the common goals, the group norms, all these ingredients blend together. Groups can form for 1,000 different reasons. There are groups like the Amish people who share philosophies and religious beliefs. There are groups of people who share political feelings, for better or worse, for good or evil. Some people form groups on the grounds of special interests, fantasies, dreams, the thrill of flying, for instance. Groups can form for combinations of reasons. Their interests can run along lines of age and sex and special interests. Here, for example, retired men have formed a choral group.
In the air, they are so proud, for if that's a county fair, while they are playing, just see them sway. It's the bright and biggest day. This is how they play at the county fair.
Now, being part of a group is generally something you want to do. You find yourself attracted to the group's norms and goals, and you want to be a part of it. For instance, suppose you volunteer for the armed forces. You like the standards and the attitudes of your comrades, and you share most of their beliefs. But suppose you don't always agree. There you are, among hundreds of others just like yourself, and you disagree with what your commander says. What do? Speak out? Of course not. You go along with what he says, and with what everybody else agrees. In other words, you conform. The fact is, most of us have built-in tendencies to go along with the group. This is actually an experiment in which the experimenters stop and begin looking into the trees. The more people looking up, the more people who stop and join in. And who wouldn't? You and I would probably do the same thing. Maybe we already have done the same thing. It's interesting the way conformity works. Sometimes it begins as a feeling of self-consciousness deep down inside. If, for example, you're in an unfamiliar place, like a fancy restaurant, you want to fit in. You may sense that there are standards for proper behavior, but perhaps you don't know what they are, and you feel clumsy, inadequate, exposed. You want to be like everybody else, but you simply don't know how. So you try to act cool. You notice a group of young sophisticates who obviously know the rules, and you try to imitate their actions. It's probably the basis of the old saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Of course, you risk losing your individuality if you imitate your peers. And maybe you don't want to be just like everyone else. Maybe at heart, you're a nonconformist. You decide to rebel. You challenge the norms of your group, in this case, the codes of proper business attire. Does the group defend its standards? Most definitely. And if you somehow feel disapproval in the air, perhaps it comes from the disapproving eyes upon you. The other members put pressure on those who flout the rules.
Where did you get that suit, man?
You like it?
Was that the clown that designed that thing?
The clown, right?
You
Let me put the buttons on for you.
Huh?
Come forward. You like the suit, boy?
Look at the Bob Hope suit. Bob suit, you wait, you open it.
Most of us respond quickly to the group's desires. The embarrassment alone is almost unbearable. We'll do almost anything to avoid the burning shame of public ridicule. But anyone who continues to flout the norms may be expelled by the group and be cut off from further interaction. In extreme cases, the group may use Gestapo techniques.
Gestapo originally came back from Germany. Back in the Nazi days, the Gestapo wanted to do the torture to the Americans. So that's what we got in our gangs too, a Gestapo. For those who do wrong.
In groups like this, with close, tight-knit memberships, the pressure to conform might amount to physical force. But the group does stay together. But an experiment by Solomon Asch in the 1940s showed how effective subtle pressure can be. Only one student was being tested. The others were accomplices.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order.
2.
2. 2.
2.
3.
3. 3.
On the third trial, the accomplices lied about what they saw.
2. 2. 2.
What he saw did not agree with what the others said they saw. This difference stirred up great conflict in our unsuspecting subject. Line 2 was clearly shorter than the standard on the left. Yet the subject conformed to the group opinion. It turns out that a few people handle this conflict by changing their perceptions. They actually come to think that the two lines are the same length. But here's another experiment.
1.
1.
1.
The subject held no delusions about which line was longer. He believed his eyes. But he handled his inner conflict by eventually going along with the others, at least publicly.
2.
He saw no reason at this point to make waves. Whether agreeing or simply going along with things, this tendency to conform with our comrades has been used to great evil against us. On the other hand, conformity is half of cooperation. And cooperation has given us many of our great triumphs, be they surgery in the brain or exploration in space. But then conformity can also be used for discipline, even punishment. In Zimbardo's prison experiment, the student guards began to enforce discipline with frequent countdown sessions.
Okay, let's take it from the beginning again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
The countdowns are pointless drills, so count backwards.
10, 9, 8, 7.
Punishment was seldom specific.
5.
Everyone will be punished for 0, 7, 1, 5, 3.
Push-ups for all and guilt for all, even when only one prisoner is guilty.
Now 0, 1, 7, 5, 3 is in solitary confinement. That's all your fault. And he will stay there until one of you gives up your blanket.
It was too much. The prisoners rebelled. Behavior became so brutal that the experiment was stopped. It had been planned to last 3 weeks. Zimbardo abandoned it after 6 days. Zimbardo's work points to another aspect of group pressure: obedience. You might regard obedience as an extreme kind of conformity, but obedience is actually a separate category. Obedience differs from conformity in that you conform to peer pressure, but obey a figure of authority, usually a person with power above and beyond the influence of your peers. The classic work on obedience is the famous experiment by Stanley Milgram. In this repeat of his work, we see how it was done. Milgram used 2 adults from the community to perform his test. One was called the learner, the other was called the teacher. The experiment was supposed to test how electric shocks affected the learner's performance. Every time the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher was to shock him with a stronger jolt than the one before, or so Milgram had them believe. Actually, the learner was working with Milgram and would not really receive shocks. He would only act as if he had. The experiment was really a test of the teacher's obedience. The teacher was the true experimental subject. He knew nothing of the supposed learner's act and thought the electric shocks were real. How far would the teacher subject go to obey Milgram's instructions? Would his conscience overcome his obedience? The experiment began. The teacher subject read pairs of words which the learner was told to remember. Then the teacher tested the learner by asking him to signal the correct word combinations.
Okay, learner, we're gonna start. Blue, boy, girl, grass, hat. Correct. Nice. Day, sky, job, chair. Wrong. 15 volts. The right answer is girl.
As the learner continued to miss the correct answers, Milgram told his teacher subject to keep increasing the voltage. With each jolt, the learner groaned. Then his groans became screams. This deeply disturbed the teacher.
Wrong. It's 30 volts. Wrong. 120 volts. The right answer is hair. Cool. Day, shade, water, cave. Wrong. 135 volts. Wrong. 300 volts.
Ah! Please! Please let me out of here! God, it hurts! I'm not going to answer anymore! Oh, I quit! God, it really hurts!
The agonizing screams drove the teacher subject into a state of terrible conflict. Compassion struggled with obedience. And then Milgram stepped in with words of higher authority. The teacher subject had no choice. He had to go on. But it was all right because the experiment demanded it.
New. House, pet, book name. What do I do, Dr. Lynch? There's no answer.
Consider no answer a wrong answer and continue the experiment.
Wrong. 315 volts. The right answer is book. Quiet, song, party, child, evening. Wrong. 330 volts. Cake, man, girl. Wrong, 450 volts.
When the test was finished, Milgram interviewed the teacher subject, as reenacted here. Milgram told him what had actually taken place, and that the learner was alive and had suffered no pain at all. This turned out to be rather hard for the teacher to swallow.
I mean, you said to continue. I shocked the guy because he wasn't learning. If I'd stopped, I wouldn't have been doing what you said to do. I mean, I was supposed to do it. I had to do it.
Milgram repeated his test a number of times. And the sobering fact is, almost 2/3 of teacher subjects also apparently shocked their learners into dead silence with electric doses that could not be increased. The original work was criticized because Milgram tested only white, middle-class males. But more recent tests have shown that women, children, and different ethnic groups behave in much the same way. Other critics claim that the reputation of Yale University, where Milgram ran his test, convinced people that nothing wrong would be allowed to happen. But when Milgram later repeated the identical experiments off campus, he found the same results. It's not a pleasant thought, but Milgram may have found a dark side to our human natures. Milgram, however, caused greater concern for another reason: his use of deception. His entire experiment depended on misleading his subjects. And many people feel that this was wrong because it might have damaged the subjects' psyches. There's a real dilemma here, for science requires one to analyze life in unemotional terms. And yet some topics can't be studied when people are aware of what's going on. To succeed, you've simply got to deceive. So psychology has had to work out a code of experimental ethics to guide its research. There are 3 main points that psychologists must follow in designing their tests. First, they must be sure there will be no serious or lasting harm. Second, they must disclose all aspects of the test that might reasonably affect your willingness to participate. And third, the experimenter must take responsibility for removing any undesirable consequences of the testing. If you need therapy or medical aid after serving as a subject, the experimenter must pay for it. Today, you can safely assume that any experiment you join will be painless and harmless. Here's an example of how a modern-day psychologist might use deception.
Okay, that will be enough for now. You can fill out the rest of those questionnaires later. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Gregor Zilstein. of the medical school's departments of neurology and psychiatry. I've asked you here today in order to serve as subjects in an experiment concerned with the effects of electric shock.
When he's got his results, he explains to his subjects what he's done.
Okay, now that I've got all the questionnaires, I have a surprise for you. We are not going to give you any electric shocks whatsoever. In fact, the experiment is over. And I should tell you that I am not a neurologist, but a social psychologist. And what we were really after were your responses to these questionnaires.
Psychologists like Milgram, Zimbardo, and Ash have begun to show how our social nature is put together. It's now clear from studies on conformity and obedience that we have weaknesses, traits which can turn us against ourselves and against our futures. But we must also realize that these same traits generate the awesome joy and strength of social cooperation. Most of what we've attained, or will ever attain, comes straight from people who conform and obey, and who can work and celebrate together. It's encouraging to realize that obedience and conformity are counteracted by other tendencies. Research today is finding that some of us seem to have urges which fight conformity. Now, these people resist the pressures that make most of us imitate our comrades. Somehow it's comforting to know that nonconformity has a natural place in our world, and that nonconformists will always be around to disrupt things.